Everybody who's written a book knows that a person is at his or her most boring just after they've written and had the book published. But this book does reflect, dare I say it, 30 plus years of work on labour issues around the world, mainly in the ILO. And I'm going to highlight 6 themes from the book. And behind some of the themes there is a ghost, but I won't introduce the ghost until about halfway through. And there's also a prologue to complicate matters even more. Now, the key concept that I'm going to be using is commodification. Now, commodification has been used in various senses of the term, but I'm going to use it in basically supply and demand determines the price, it's subject to market forces and so on, and it lacks agency. So a commodity lacks agency. Second concept that I'll be using and is used in the book is social income. Social income is all components of our income, including money income and benefits, enterprise benefits, state benefits and community benefits of various sorts. And the distribution of social income varies across country, type of production system and over time, as I'll be arguing. Now the prologue, and I'm going to flash through several parts of these themes simply to keep our time sensible. The prologue is about work, what we mean by work. Now every age since the ancient Greeks has had its silliness when it's talked about work, and no age more so than the current age. For the ancient Greeks, labour was done by the non-citizens, by the banosoi, whereas work was what one did around the house with one's relatives and friends in the spirit of philia. And the key thing was to maximize skole, leisure, which is a combination of learning and public participation in the life of polis. And I think it's very important to develop a distinction between work and labour, and play and leisure, so that these figure quite strongly throughout the book. And I think the classic aphorism of Arthur Pigou, who was Professor of Economics at Cambridge, as you know, in early part of the 20th century, summed up the silliness of the 20th century model of labourism, when he said that if he hired a housekeeper, national income went up. If he married her, national income went down. And we've suffered from that, and it's been a very sexist labourism ever since the beginning of the 20th century. And I think it's very important to keep the distinction of labour and work, and I'll come back to that later. Now, the first theme of the book goes back to 1944, and 3 documents that were published around the same time. The first one, on which I draw quite heavily, is Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, where he traced the development of national markets through a period dominated by financial capital, and he made the famous aphorism that laissez-faire was planned. You can see Polanyian model in terms of labour commodification during the 19th and early part of the 20th century, through the Spinenland and the Poor Law, and mainly focusing on Britain, where the wage part of social income rose, and all forms of community benefits and other forms of benefits were phased out. But the period of commodification led to massive insecurities, inequalities, and leading up to the Great Crash, 1929-32. And this was the period of disembedded, where the economic system was disembedded from society. Now, at that point, Polanyi, being an optimist, said that the state would re-embed the economic system in society. Now, I am slightly critical of Polanyi's model. It had a whiff of end of history about it, but nevertheless, it's very fruitful in terms of the concepts, and I'm particularly pleased that his daughter has endorsed the book and read it very thoroughly, and is a fine economist in her own right. Now, the second book was Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. I'll come back to that later. Now, the irony was that in the early 30s, these two gentlemen, Polanyi and Hayek, were at the same Vienna Institute, and apparently they used to walk past each other in the early morning at around breakfast time, doff their hats in a very Viennese way, and say good morning, and that was it. And it's a rather appropriate little story. Now, the third document that came out was the ILO's Philadelphia Declaration. And that declaration has a one-line famous or infamous aphorism: labor is not a commodity. Now, I have many scars on my back from my many years working in the ILO, because I've always puzzled about that, because it strikes me that any economics textbook would tell you that labor is a commodity because it is subject to a price, a wage. But nevertheless, the essence of the ILO model, following the Treaty of Versailles and when it was set up, was promoting decent labor. There was a very particular model that it promoted around the world, where employees were vulnerable, employers were seen as powerful, had collective bargaining of a particular type that was built into it, freedom of association, again, of a particular type, labor-based social security, which was highly sexist, highly social insurance oriented. Anyone wanting to read the most sexist document you can find in the sphere of labor should read Convention 102 of the ILO. And in 2001, the governments of the world declared that this was an up-to-date convention. It was one of the up-to-date conventions. And of course, they had labor law as key to the laborist model. A feature of that period was that managers, as Berlin Means told us many years ago, took over from the owners in running the labor show effectively. Now, Polanyi and the ILO ushered in a period of what I call fictitious labor decommodification. Now, Gösta Espin Anderson's famous book on the three worlds of welfare capitalism talks about labor decommodifying tendencies of welfare states, but it's a very funny form of decommodification, because although the wage share of social income declined, and that in a sense is decommodifying, nevertheless, in order to get entitlement to the benefits of society through state benefits and enterprise, you had to be in the labor market for the mainstream. So it was essentially saying, you know, you had to be in the labor market. Now, and it promoted a particular form of laborism, which was beautifully analyzed and thoroughly critiqued by Hannah Arendt in 1957, and which she called the job holder society, this romanticizing of jobs, which became a feature of that period. I call that the industrialization, the industrial citizenship era, far from being a golden age. Anybody who uses the term golden age to describe that period is, in my view, an ass, because it was far from being golden. It was highly sexist, highly hierarchical, and essentially made people performing labor, put them in a subordinated relationship. But in any case, it all came unraveled in the 70s, and that leads to the next theme of the book, which is the period of labor recommodification in the globalization era. Now, the title of the book is Work After, with the italics in the word after globalization, because I genuinely believe that the globalization era came to an end in 2008 with the financial crash. But essentially, the globalization was the disembedded phase of the global transformation. So that whereas Polanyi had been about the development of national markets, this has been all about the development of a global market system. And in a sense, it was Hayek's revenge on Polanyi. And Hayek, had gone off in 1947 and set up the Mont Pelerin Society. I don't know if everybody knows the Mont Pelerin Society, but it is a fascinating society because 36 people attended the first meeting in Montreux, in Switzerland, just near where I've lived for a long time.